Okay, I think we can probably get started now. It's 3 minutes past, so I think hopefully we've got everyone that's coming along. So yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Poverty Alliance Get Heard Scotland webinar. So my name is Neil Cowan, and I'm Policy and Campaigns Manager at the Poverty Alliance. So this morning is the third and final webinar in our series of Get Heard Scotland webinars that we've been holding over the last 3 weeks. For those of you that don't know, Get Heard Scotland is an initiative that we at the Poverty Alliance have been running for the last 3 years, going into its 4th year. It's funded by the Scottish Government as part of the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. And the aim of Get Heard Scotland is very simply to ensure that people with experience of poverty in Scotland, as well as organisations working with people living in poverty, particularly community organisations, are able to have a meaningful say in the shaping and the delivery of national and anti-poverty policy in Scotland. So this webinar and other two that we've already held in the last couple of weeks will sit alongside interviews and focus groups and discussions with people living on low incomes, as well as the organisations that work with them, with a real kind of express intent that they feed into the development of the new Scottish Government Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, which has been developed at the moment and which will be published next year. And as I said, this webinar is the third and final webinar of this series. So previous webinars, well, the first one looked at the development of child poverty strategy and looking at examples, particularly from across the world. Last week's looked at incomes, and this morning's will take a particular look at the kind of services that we need in Scotland to better prevent and reduce child poverty. So we've got a really brilliant lineup of speakers. So we have Sapphire Raymond, who's the Director of One Parent Families Scotland, we've got Martin Dorchester, CEO of Includem, and we've got Mark Hardy of the Scottish Association of Social Work, who's kindly stepped in for his colleague Alison. And each of the speakers will speak for around 15 minutes each, and we'll then have plenty of time for questions and for discussion. And we'd obviously be really keen to hear from you, not only with questions, but also with your own comments, your own thoughts, your own contributions. So please do use the chat function as we go to submit questions or comments or thoughts. And we'll also open the discussion out later as well. So yeah, don't be shy when that happens. I'm sure we're all probably quite bored of hearing this now, but do keep your mic off unless you're speaking. And also just to note that we'll be recording the meeting today just to share with folk that were unable to make it. We did have a lot of interest in the event, so keen to make sure that we can get the discussion shared as widely as possible. That's probably enough spiel from me. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Sapphire Raymond, who's Director of One Parent Families Scotland. So OPFS, One Parent Families Scotland, is the leading charity working with single parent families in Scotland. So they provide advice, practical support, and campaign with parents to make their voices heard, to change the systems, the policies, and the attitudes that too often disadvantage single parent families. So Sapphire, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers and also the conversation that's going to take place afterwards. I'm going to be speaking about childcare, and it feels like it's a topic that in the 10-11 years since I've been back in Scotland working at One Parent Families Scotland is one that comes up time and again. And whilst we've seen some incremental changes, we haven't seen the sort of wholesale systems change that we need to support all families, but especially families on low incomes with caring responsibilities. And in particular, I would say single parent families who have no one else to share those caring responsibilities with. So why is childcare important for tackling child poverty? I mean, 1 in 4 of children living in poverty in Scotland live in a single parent household. So we would argue that working with this group is vital if we're going to reach the targets, the interim targets by 2023 and the ultimate targets by 2030, and to prevent more children growing up in hardship. Childcare is one of the biggest issues for single parents in education, training or employment, and it can be the costs, the lack of flexibility, the fact that things are piecemeal, not joined up. So it might mean that there's a whole series of journeys they need to undertake to ensure their children are in different types of care. The costs of working, the flexible labour market, the low pay make it very difficult for single parents to see paid work as a route out of poverty. And the COVID crisis has exacerbated all this for single parents in terms of costs and availability, having to manage everything on themselves at home, putting themselves I suppose, at the back of the queue in terms of what do I need to be doing and focusing on their children, homeschooling, all those things. And actually, we've undertaken some research I'll talk about. And one of the things the single parents involved in that said was that for them, it's not going to be like picking up from where they left off at the start of the pandemic. There are many things where they feel that they will need support to get back even to the stage they were before the pandemic, let alone how we support them in the recovery after the pandemic. The Social Renewal Advisory Board, the Economic Recovery Group, the Childcare Commission, the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls have all spoken about the need to address childcare as an issue, as a systemic issue, and how it's critical to solve the problems and the issues, but we need to be considering it holistically. So we need a childcare service, I would argue, that helps manage the complexities of families' lives. That can be a focal point for integrating with other services like employability, financial inclusion, family support, mental health and well-being, that provides the quality experience for children. Because I think one of the debates we quite often get caught up in is how can we be flexible in this way and still have a quality experience for children? Well, I would argue you can do it, and we've piloted some work which has now become a separate organisation called Flexible Childcare Services Scotland, but it does require an awful lot of organisation and investment to do so. It doesn't come cheap, but a quality service quite often doesn't. It can enable parents with the opportunities to study or train, and it needs to be flexible and responsive to changing circumstances. So I'm just going to quickly share a screen, and this is a case study of a single parent with 3 children. And she has children across the age range. I think her oldest is early 20s, and then she's got one at secondary school and a younger one who at this time was just 2 years old. She works as a social care practitioner in a neighbouring borough, and she has to work 12 to 13-hour shifts. She'd asked for shorter shifts. They weren't available, she was told. They're in temporary accommodation, and so no longer living in the area where she had the childminder close to where she lived. So her and her 2-year-old leave home at 6 a.m. in the morning, a bus or taxi to the childminder across the city. She then travels by bus to the neighbouring local authority to start her work shift. So already there's 2 to 3 hours there before she's even got through the door to work. Childminder takes care of the child from 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. and she gets there till 12:20, takes the child to nursery, collects the child from nursery, and then stays with the childminder until the mum's able to come pick the child up. And sometimes that could be 10:30 p.m. before she gets there. Or if the older sister, who also does shift work, has a shift which finishes earlier, she can come and collect her younger sibling. So you can see how complicated that is in terms of just the logistics of the day, but also the stresses in the day. And some of the other issues is because when I was looking at this, I was thinking, okay, this is a couple of years ago that we started working with this parent. So some things might have changed. We've now got 1140 hours. That might help with some of the costs, but there's still the issue of wraparound, particularly early in the morning and then late at night. And then there's weekend childcare because it's a 7-day-a-week service. She can be asked to work any of those days. So some of these might be things we're looking at how we can address. Others are things that are still intractables in some way and that we're expecting families to be able to manage the complexities and the costs of. And I think that's the big issue with childcare in a way. I'm going to stop sharing this now, sorry, because it is complex. It's not simple. And so when we undertook some research just earlier this year, a piece of work on freeing low-income single parents from in-work poverty's grip. So this was looking at if work is going to be that route out of poverty, how can we support single parents to do so? There was focus groups and interviews, first of all identifying what the issues were and then working with the parents to see what would be the types of solutions that would work for you. And so I'd shown you a case study from 2 years ago. I'm now going to talk about earlier this year, and you can see how little will have changed. The consistent experience that parents spoke about was a lack of high quality, affordable, wraparound childcare, which also meets the needs of children under 3 and disabled children. Many of the parents we work with, as well as child caring, are carers also. For single parents to ever have that sort of equal access to the labour market, and if we want to break that cycle of poverty, we do need to look at how we transform childcare provision. And I think we've started that journey. It's incremental, but there are some things we need to focus more on. Because one of the things that came out strongly was the frustration from single parents about having to repeat their experiences of inequality, particularly in relation to inadequate and inaccessible childcare provision. They'd participated in lots of consultative events before around childcare and felt they either weren't being listened to or were being ignored. So actually this is long overdue. It's not about asking to share experiences, but looking at what we need to do to radically improve and transform those experiences. Every focus group, every interview, childcare came up, and they regarded it as being intrinsically linked to what types of jobs they could do that were available in the labour market. First thing was the escalating cost of childcare. For many single parents, there was little value in pursuing a paid role where all of their income would be spent on childcare costs. The case study I just took you through earlier, that parent told us that sometimes at the end of the week, she was £6 better off. They still had to go to food banks. You know, the costs of working were such. One single parent explained, to put my children into after school care, it was looking at about £600 a month. I don't know how parents do it. Single parents can't do it. That's a big barrier. Second issue was availability. Single parents expressed they could only access childcare if the local childcare providers had places available for their children. And the pandemic's had a big impact on this as well. The job, there was no childcare space, so I'm stuck. Then there was the issue of wraparound childcare that I've spoken about. Even with the 1140 hours being offered flexibly, there are still limits to what can be done. And we have a much more flexible labour market, which requires workers and parents to be more available. And so there's what can we do with the wraparound, with the weekends, and how do we make it something that's fun and enjoyable for children and young people who are going to be using it? And I think that's always been that sort of, the sort of two issues that we need to look at, because the final issue was inflexibility. And that fact that we have very much a sort of hours-based approach. And, like I said, it's built around a traditional day, and that's no longer what we've got. So in terms of what the parents said for what would help, they want to look to see how we can develop high quality, affordable, flexible childcare that looks at the needs for older children and can provide for children with additional support needs as well. The wraparound childcare and the flexibility, they're the things. And actually, way back in 1998, when we first started talking about a national childcare strategy, we spoke about availability, accessibility, quality, and flexibility. And they're still the things we're trying to knit together to build a childcare system that works for all. How can we do it? How can we build on what we have? Because if we're looking at the next child poverty delivery plan, there's the Accessible Childcare Fund. There are pilots being done through that. But it's how do we scale up and make it mainstream practice? Because we've tested, we've piloted, parents have told us time and again what they need. It's about what do we need to do next. And I was looking through sort of election manifestos, and I was looking at the SNP one, and there was the commitment to expand free high quality childcare. We've got the 1140 now, but there was a commitment to look at how we could build on that further to do wraparound childcare. And that was one of the things I think we need to be pushing the government on and making it part of one of the priorities in the child poverty delivery plan. And to ensure that those on low, one of the things they said was those on lowest incomes will pay nothing and others will make fair and affordable contributions. And I think that's critical. And that is one of the things we really need to focus on to make sure that that is also then being translated into action in the child poverty delivery plan. And we need a strategy for childcare. And it's a strategy that has to go across a whole series of directorates and services, not just sit within a particular silo, because this is not a siloed issue. We need coherence across a range of different actions that we can take. Many of us, like I said, the Advisory Council, the Childcare Commission, Social Renewal Advisory Board, etc. I think it's possibly in the gender pay gap as well, gender pay gap action plan, is we need an entitlement to access 50 hours of childcare that's affordable and flexible. And that doesn't mean that we have these incredibly long days of a child sat in one place. We can be creative about how we do that and limit the amount contributed. Because what we need is a childcare service that's going to help manage the complexity of families' lives, be a focal point for integrating with other services. Like I said, provide the experience for children, enable parents to be able to access training and qualifications. So we don't just have single parents moving into entry-level jobs and cycling in and out of entry-level jobs, but can actually stay in work, progress work, and have a sustainable work experience. And that doesn't act as a further drain on household incomes and trapping families into poverty. So it comes into reducing household incomes, part of the sort of driver diagram for child poverty, as well as increasing income from work. And I'll just end by saying that what we need to do is see it as an enabler, a social enabler, economic enabler, and community enabler, because childcare can be part of the local infrastructure and the assets that we have in our local communities. And I would say not to invest in it will make it significantly more difficult to meet our child poverty targets and achieve what is our national mission, which is to end child poverty. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Satwat. That was great. And I think, yeah, really clearly set out that it's the absolute centrality of childcare and tackling child poverty. And I think the case study that you showed set out just really clearly the kind of bind that, yeah, as you say, so many old parents find themselves in. I think as well, what you said around, we've had lots of tests, lots of pilots, etc. Now's the time to kind of get on and do stuff, is I suppose where we're at across the board, and we'll maybe come to that a little bit later as well. So next up is Martin. So Martin Dorchester. Martin is CEO of Includem. So Includem are a youth support charity that works with young people and families who are often excluded from mainstream services in order to help them transform their lives. So Martin, thanks very much for joining us, and yeah, over to you.
Yeah, hi Neil, thanks very much. Satwat and I followed each other a few times on things like this, so it was powerful, and I'll reflect on some of the research we're doing as well, and I'll share a case study. I'm going to start my presentation with a question, and I'll end it with a question, and I'm going to try and be deliberately provocative because I genuinely don't feel we're doing enough, and I feel we've been too accepting. And I would maybe ask people to think, has poverty lost the power of that meaning? Because I sort of think it has, and I think that we talk about different types of poverty, and we talk about poverty, and we talk about measures of poverty. Today I'm going to talk to you about destitution, because that's what we're seeing with our families. So hopefully I can bring this up for you. Fantastic, it's working. So I'm going to start with a question saying, is it time for us to start talking about destitution and well-being? And I'll end on a very similar question. I think the first thing that I would say is we're underestimating the scale of the need and the scale of the response. I'm going to talk to you about the families that Includem works with. We work with families who for generations have been in entrenched poverty. And even if we hit the 2030 targets, this will be the 10% that basically sees no effect still from that. This is the group that do not sign up to YouGov surveys that are difficult to reach, or we make it difficult for them to reach us, who suffer from the stigma of poverty and will not see a benefit from the work that we think that we're going to deliver in 2030. We don't hear them, so we tend therefore not to respond to what they need because we don't know what they need. And one of the things that we found in the pandemic that has really helped us is that we have used people with lived experience to do peer research. So we've generated 3 pieces of research over the last 15, 18 months, one on poverty, one on attainment, which is very relevant given Scottish League tables are out, and I've got it in front of me, one on digital, where everyone had talked about digital inclusion, we talked about digital exclusion, because the families that we were working with were excluded. and continue to be excluded. I've got a sticky laptop, so I can't bounce that back. But during the period, we've put about 150k into supporting the families that we work with. That was about 300 families. If you do the maths on that over a 12-month period, that's an extra £10 a week on top of what they were already getting. So we would go immediately into the payment recommended going to be enough for these families. This has just been helping them service the debt that they already had. This has just been helping them to survive with other things supporting them. So we would suggest that the payment of £20, which we're talking about getting now, yes, please have it now, but it's still not enough. It will still not take them out of poverty. It will still not take them out of destitution. It will just keep it ticking over at best. What are the families that we said, we supported said to us? Well, when we looked at what the funding was and what we were spending their money on, and when we looked at the survey, it would have suggested that it was technical and digital and things that would help them access learning and things online. Actually, if you look at the numbers there, that was less than a quarter of what we were spending money on. Where we were spending money on, over 50% is on food, essential items, clothing, white goods and furniture. That to me is not poverty. That to me is destitution. We're absolutely helping people to fund living day to day. The digital devices is over and above that. We were funding people to survive. And I think we need to start getting our heads around that. This is not poverty. This is not what I would call abject poverty. This is destitution. What did they say to us? One of the offshoots or one of the underpinning pillars of poverty and destitution is you lose hope and aspiration. It's not just going to be enough to help people afford to live. You've got to give them hope and aspiration of why they should as well. Otherwise, you just keep repeating the same generational cycles. And they also wanted time. They wanted time from services. They wanted time from people. They wanted time from schools to help them bridge that. So it's not just enough to give them money. We've got to give more than that. We've got to give our time. We've got to give our quality. We've got to give them hope. We've got to give them aspiration. I wanted to share a case study because they're always powerful to share. And it's real. And touching on the case study that Satwat had just touched on. So we worked with a family. There were 3 teenage boys in this family. And over a period of time, we started to build that relationship with them. There were complaints from school about the boys in the family, about them not performing. We got contact from the police, which is how we got involved with them. And then over time, we got to know this family. And what did we discover about this family? So here was a family that these children had not slept in a bed of their own. Not only had they not slept in a bed of their own, they didn't have a washing machine. So they couldn't wash their clothes in a washing machine. So when you looked at the issues that they were having at school, what you encountered was not getting proper sleep, not being able to wash their school uniforms. So was it surprising that they would sleep in? Was it surprising that they would turn up late for school? And no one had picked up on this. They weren't on anyone's register, apart from the fact that the police had touched base with us. We discovered one of the children was autistic and therefore needed support in learning. We discovered the family didn't have the funds to be able to do any of that, so needed financial support. And they also needed that time that people could give them to engage with them. Again, you'd talk about this family being in poverty, and I would talk about this family being in destitution. We asked them why they hadn't spoken to any of the services to help them, and they were ashamed. And the stigma of being poor, the stigma of being destitute, the stigma of admitting that they were sleeping in the same bed as their mum, which was basically a mattress on the floor, was too much for them to talk about. And we hadn't given them the time to trust in any of our services to help them to do that. So we stepped in, and this sounds bizarre in one sense, and bought them beds, bought them washing machine, bought them clothes. And lo and behold, we started to see improvement in school attendance. We started to see improvement in their own well-being, their own health, and we started to see a different approach from them, which is not surprising. But even with all of that support, there hits a time when we're going to step away and they need that support ongoing. And even now, it's still not in place, because I go right back to that early one. They would fall into the 10% that would not benefit, that would gain significantly. And I think we need to think, if we're not careful, I will say we've done a really good job here. We have delivered to 90% of the population, and 90% is a fantastic result. And I would go, that's great, but we don't deliver to the 10% that we work with. And I would argue 100% of the 10% we work with, we let down. I touched on it in terms of social factors, as well as the physical and fiscal support that we need to give. We absolutely need to look at how services are responsive, where are the safe places, how well we've got trauma-informed services, and what are the social determinants. I think this illustration by Juliet Young absolutely sums up the research that we have seen with our families, especially over the last 15 months. We picked off some of the quotes from the people that we work with, and we're very happy to share this research. I think one of the things that also came out in the work that we do with our families is paying them and giving them funding now is not going to be enough, because they're already in entrenched poverty and entrenched debt. And so some of the things that we're doing, we're finding is that we're helping them service a debt that they never get out of. So actually, they never step forward. We think we're helping them, but they never step forward, because that debt is still there hanging over them, and it gets bigger. Some of the things that we're doing are great, so free school meals and universal free school meals, but we need to do more. So what do we think will make a difference to families in the long term? So that support which raises hope and aspiration. We would argue, and we keep arguing, debt cancellation. It's just no good giving people the finance to service their debt, because they can't get out of it then. They're in a spiral. So debt cancellation. I think everyone knows this, £20 now. And I think there's got to be no debate about this now. And even at that, I don't think £20 is enough, but we want it now. Open that conversation. We need to change the infrastructure. Satwat touched on one element of it, but we need to change the infrastructure. But we also need to talk about the well-being gap, not just the attainment gap. Because otherwise it takes us down a channel. I like quotes, and my organization know that I like quotes. We run into it all the time, that the families we try and work with and help feel stigmatized. And they feel despair, and we need to walk the talk about we're all in this together and believe it. And finally, I just want to challenge us again, are we becoming a bit tokenistic about talking about poverty? And should we be talking about destitution? Because our sense at the moment is we should. Thanks, Neil. I hope that was okay for time.
That was perfect for time, Martin. Thanks very much. And I think that was a great overview and a reminder of the kind of depth of poverty and, as you say, destitution that exists, and also a really good challenge in the sense of, although our child poverty targets are ambitious in terms of meeting that 10% figure by 2030, actually that still means that 10% of children in Scotland are living in poverty, and that's not good enough. So I think that's a hugely important challenge. And you use the word provocation at the start. I think provocation is probably what we need in general, but certainly as part of this discussion. So thank you very much for that. Next up to speak is Mark Hardy. So Mark is here on behalf of the Scottish Association of Social Work. So Mark is a children and family social worker based in Edinburgh, and is also currently conducting PhD research which looks at some of the links between social work and poverty. And today's also Mark's final day in his current post. So yeah, thanks very much, Mark, for taking the time out of what I'm sure is a pretty busy day finishing up to join us for this discussion. So thanks very much, and over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Neil. I'll just try and share my screen here. Share. So, as Neil was saying, my name's Mark Hardy. I'm a children and families social worker in the northeast of Edinburgh, and currently a PhD student looking at poverty and social work assessment and decision making. I'm a member of the Scottish Association of Social Workers, which hence how I've come to be invited to speak today. I should say a brief disclaimer in that any views within here are my own. I've not run them past the association, so they are my own views. But yes, I've been asked to talk about the role of social work in tackling child poverty, particularly what more could be done to strengthen that role. So a good starting point when looking at this, I think, is the International Federation of Social Workers' global definition of social work. And they say that the profession promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. And this is based on principles including social justice and human rights. And that part of the core mandate is that in solidarity with those who are disadvantaged, the profession strives to alleviate poverty. So this suggests very much a central part of the social work role is to address poverty. And looking closer to home, the social work practice is expected to be based upon the national practice model, getting it right for every child. And when looking at the needs of children and young people and assessing them and planning interventions, we're expected to use this My World Triangle, which is part of the GERFEC framework. And in it, there's some very clear links. Oh, I don't know why I skipped on there. In it, there's some very clear links to domains relating to poverty, such as enough money, work opportunities for my family, and comfortable and safe housing. So again, a prominent role for social workers in addressing poverty. However, there has been, particularly over the past 10 years, a lot of research and opinion coming out suggesting that social work is not being very successful in this part of its role. One of the most prominent research projects has been this Child Welfare Inequalities Project. This was a 4-nation study across the UK and was designed to examine how social and economic inequalities are reflected in high-end children's social care interventions. And this research has demonstrated a social gradient to social work intervention. That is that children living in poverty are much more likely to be accommodated in local authority care, be subject to child protection measures, become involved in crime, require mental health services, and be referred to the children's hearing system. So really strong association there between poverty and high-end social work interventions. Now, despite this association, the project's findings were also that poverty has become what they term the wallpaper of practice, and it's too big to tackle, too familiar to notice. Now, this blindness towards poverty within social work has resulted in the profession paying little attention towards how to intervene in relation to poverty. And one of the papers coming out of this project have a quote from, and the authors say that despite clear evidence that poverty is a contributory causal factor in children's health and welfare, arguably the most important single factor, social work policy and practice have not effectively addressed this issue at any level. So when we consider, well, why is social work not more poverty aware or isn't doing more to address social work, there's a range of possibilities from the research evidence base and also from practice experience, social workers often appear to be fearful that by talking about poverty affecting families, that this will stigmatise families. They often cite the high workload and feeling overwhelmed, and within that little time to look at the impact of poverty on families, a feeling of powerlessness in actually being able to make changes that will have an impact on families' poverty, that it isn't actually a central part of social work role, and particularly in relation to children and families social work in statutory settings, that's very much focused around child protection and risk. There's evidence of an individual narrative of poverty being adopted by social workers, a lack of awareness about the impact, and this focus on risk, and actually that talking about poverty or wider structural inequalities affecting families and children's health and welfare somehow takes the focus away from parenting responsibilities and risk. When we look at some of the kind of core documents underpinning social work practice, there's also evidence that the profession hasn't really been effectively addressing poverty. So the National Risk Framework, which is to be used by social workers to support the assessment of children and young people, within this document, poverty is only mentioned twice. Firstly, as one of 39 risk indicators relating to a child's parent or carer. And secondly, as one of 16 risk indicators relating to a child's wider world. And in the National Guidance for Child Protection from 2014, this mentions poverty only 4 times compared to, for example, the mentions of neglect 73 times. It's also worth noting that in the first Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, there was no mention of social work. So from this very quick overview, it can be argued that despite the mandate to alleviate poverty, social work fails to adequately even consider it. And further, Callum Webb of the Child Welfare Inequalities Project argues that on the rare occasion when social work appears in discussions about poverty, it is viewed fairly unproblematically as part of the solution, despite the evidence indicating that at best, social work perpetuates social inequality and at worst exacerbates it. However, that's, I suppose, the kind of critical side there. It has been noteworthy that in Scotland over the past few years, there have been moves relating to social work to try to address this. So the promise was the outcome of the independent review of Scotland's care system, published the findings last year, very much informed by Child Welfare Inequalities Project. It highlights poverty as a driving factor in young people entering the care system through its impact on the resources that families have for meeting children's needs, and through the stress that poverty places upon parents. And as you can see from this slide, there's a range of actions that are recommended in order to address this, most of which are relevant to social work services. I've highlighted one here relating to providing support through universal services. So I think there is an onus still on universal services to be the ones addressing poverty. And whilst I'm certainly not arguing against the importance of this, it maybe reflects the idea that poverty prevention and alleviation is more of a role for universal services rather than children and family social work, which has, in some respects, become synonymous with child protection rather than addressing children's wider needs beyond safety. The draft National Guidance for Child Protection in Scotland that was published last year, however, I think seeks to address this. And actually, the final document for the final National Guidance, I think, should be due out any time now. It states that recognising the context of risk and need entails a recognition of the influence of structural inequalities such as poverty. And also the consideration of the impact of poverty on children is a core consideration in child protection assessment and family support. So very much looking to bring poverty to the forefront of social work assessment, decision-making and intervention. There's an explicit change in tone as well in the new guidance, much more emphasis on engagement and collaboration with families and strengthening relationships. And whilst it's something of a crude measure, it's noteworthy that compared to the 4 times poverty as mentioned in the 2014 guidance, the new draft guidance mentions poverty 73 times. So I think that strongly indicates that poverty is being brought into focus within new policy affecting social work. There's also been a range of publications looking to affect and influence social work practice and provide kind of framework of recommendations for how to make social work practice more anti-poverty or poverty aware. So there's the Anti-Poverty Practice Framework for Social Work in Northern Ireland, published by the Department of Health in Northern Ireland, and also the Anti-Poverty Practice Guide for Social Work, produced by the UK-wide Professional Association. And both of these documents strongly informed by the Welfare Inequalities Project. We also have Development Poverty Aware Practice, particularly around the work of Michelle Krumanivo and colleagues in Israel. Now, from all these new reports and reviews and frameworks, I think it's possible to kind of discern 2 developing strands within the recommendations for how the social work role needs to be developed or needs to be changed. Firstly, pragmatic responses, in the hope that actually by making some improvements to how social work practice is done, but within the current way in which social work is organised, that can have an impact on child poverty. So, for example, trying to make services more strength and relationship based, with much more focus on keeping people at the front, at the centre of service delivery rather than the needs of services. Changing the language of care to make it less judgmental or stereotyping, challenging that dominant individual narrative on poverty, and really recognising poverty as a violation of human rights and a social injustice. It's a role for social work here in taking on more of an advocacy role and ensuring people's rights are respected in relation to things such as welfare and housing and other areas, providing much more kind of material and practical and emotional support to families. And I think there has been something of a pivot towards this during COVID through trying to address digital exclusion, help out with food parcels, paying bills, using self-directed support monies to buy toys for children, bikes, kind of outdoor activity equipment and so on, referring families for income maximisation, incorporating poverty into social work assessment much more strongly so that family difficulties are understood within their wider context. And this, to deliver all of this, I think would require investment in training, but also in reducing workloads and trying to enhance supervision through making it more reflective. Now, these more pragmatic responses, I think, although it's not a kind of sharp line that can be distinguished between these two types of responses, I think they can be distinguished to a degree from more radical responses, which look to rethink the role that social work might play within communities by trying to reconstruct the system to move away from this notify, investigate model, where this primary kind of focus of intervention is in relation to children within their family context, and moving more to a community development model, where there's more of a focus on building safety within communities and collaborating with wider networks and supports within the community. part of this would also require taking participation much more seriously, so that service development is shaped by what communities feel that they need and how it should be delivered, and then resources redistributed accordingly to reflect what communities are needing. So in conclusion, I think there are a range of ways made clear in the literature through which the social work role in addressing poverty can be enhanced. Delivering on these will depend, however, upon how much we want to invest in achieving this, and how radical we might want to be in reshaping the social work role, so that it is better able to contribute to the prevention and alleviation of poverty. And thanks for listening. That's the end of my slides, and there's some references I've provided at the end of the presentations distributed.
Thanks very much, Mark, and sorry for that little interruption there. It seems that, yeah, 18 months into the pandemic, I've still not quite worked out how to use Zoom and press the right button. So sorry for that interruption. And yeah, thanks very much for that. That was, yeah, I think a brilliant overview of the link between social work and poverty, and kind of, and what more can be done in that regard. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of these speakers for being almost literally to the minute on time as well. So that's fantastic. We've got around 30 or so minutes for questions and for discussion. We've had a few questions coming in so far via the chat function, which is great. Hopefully you can, if you want to submit some more, that'd be fantastic. Or if you want to pop your hand up using the raise the hand function, if you want to ask a question or submit a comment, then please do that. Just one question, I guess, to kick us off from me. So I suppose I think you all in different ways touched upon the kind of joining up of services. I think particularly you, Satwat, in the first contribution. And obviously we hear about this a lot, or rather about the kind of the lack of joined up services that support people living on low incomes. What are some of the practical changes that we need to see to actually address that? Because it does often feel as though we talk about it a lot without actually very much changing. So what are the kind of practical things that we need to do to better join up services, to better support people living in poverty in Scotland? Maybe come to you, Satwat, first, and then Martin, and then Mark.
There, I remember to unmute myself, which I quite often forget still after 18 months, Neil, so you're not on your own with this virtual world. I mean, I think there are practical changes that we can make. But I think the starting point has to be, and I think somebody had already put it in the chat, and I thought, yeah, we don't take the family as the starting point. We take what we do and our services as the starting point and plan on that basis. And we need to shift that around. And in order to do that, I was really struck by some of what Mark was saying. So many of our statutory services are bound by so many regulations and guidelines and protocols, and that's what, they're governed by in a way. We need to create a culture as well where we're giving staff the trust and the confidence and the permission to be able to do things differently. I think that's critical. I mean, I think one of the things that we found within the sort of COVID crisis was how for some of us working in the third sector, it's easier to shift things quicker. We're not so bound by these things in that way. We're able to get into the gaps, etc., and be able to provide the emergency support. But in terms of systemic change, I mean, it sounds really boring, but I mean, we do need to start breaking down silos. And I do think leadership plays a part in that. But that leadership is about trust as well, and being able to say, actually, if this is the outcome we want to achieve, work with the families on the best way to do it. Instead of thinking, oh, these children are not doing well at school, we need to see what it is that we can do at school to deal with that. I think Martin's example was really powerful there. There's some really simple, practical things that could happen, but you need to know the family. And they need to trust you in order for that to happen. And that's a space we don't create for a lot of our services. I mean, I totally accept the pressures and the constraints financially services are under. But actually, I think it is about shifting culture to break down some of those silos and being able to say, actually, if in this community, these are the outcomes we all need to work, how do you work together to do so? And you've got the permission to do so. And I'm not going to come and say, actually, now you've not done X, Y, and Z, and look at this risk guidance, and how do we do that? So.
Okay, thanks. And Martin, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I'll come in on the back. I absolutely agree with that. I think one, we need to be braver. Yeah, Mark touched on it. Participation. Yeah, you know, go and ask the people who are experiencing this what they need. You know, and then listen to them, and then go away and do something about it. And I think the pandemic, you're right, Satwat, in one sense, has allowed us to stop worrying so much about whose toes we might tread on, what rule we might break, and just do the right bloody thing. And I think we need to do more of that. I think probably the other thing that I would say is, Mark, I picked up on a point Mark made that I hadn't touched on, but in our research, one of the things that we found is that our frontline people have become a little bit inured to some of the things that are happening out there, because that's not their role. And therefore they focus on what they perceive as their role, that is, you know, child protection, or, you know, for us, in a lot of the work we do is about justice, etc. So they focus on that and miss completely, you know, what the hell is going on there. And you know, and I don't think they do it consciously anymore. I think we've done that over a number of years. So there's an absolute right side. There's a cultural piece for us around, you know, let's do the right thing. And you know what? If we get it wrong, let's not rip people to pieces because they've done the right, you know, they've got it wrong. It's like, let's look at what we need to do better as we go forward. And I think we can talk forever about joining up services, etc. And the nature of services is they will have their own rules, their own regulations, and you're always going to run into that. But overriding that somewhere needs to be, I don't know, a fixed imperative that says, the final decision, do the right thing. Yeah, and we need to support that.
Thanks, Martin. And Mark?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the comments made by Satwat and Martin, and I think that there is a question of you know, how much, which I suppose highlighted within the presentation, of how much can we change within the way that services are organised at the moment, and how much do we need to be more ambitious in the changes that we're making. I suppose my main reference point is as a social worker in Edinburgh, and in the 10 years, well, I suppose actually, so working in social services for 15 years in Edinburgh, we've gone from a situation where we've had 11 social work centres providing children and family social work to 5, and I mean, we'll see whether that gets further reduced over the next few years. So as a social worker, immediately you're less in touch with the communities that you're involved in. You're having to cover much wider areas, and then having those, you know, being able to build those relationships with other services is much more difficult, because you just don't have as many repeated interactions with each service, and you just have less knowledge on the ground. I've just kind of pulled out a quote actually, in terms of, like, Edinburgh's Poverty Commission released a Just Capital report last year. I think there's much which is really positive within that, but in relation to what they're wanting staff right across health services to do is they've said they want to give staff at the front line permission to make meaningful connections and develop relationships with people, removing over-reliance on procedural, risk-averse and rule-bound approaches, and empower staff from a range of services with different skills to work together to support people with all the issues that are relevant to them. So it is, now that is very much, you know, a work in progress. You know, I think it's fair to say, but I think that is really the direction things need to take. In people, regardless of what position they're in, need to be able to have sensitive conversations with people about their circumstances and poverty that's impacting upon them, and feel empowered to be able to help them to do something about that. And I think probably to a degree that will require trying to free people's time up a bit more to be able to do that, because when workers feel under pressure and in crisis, they become very focused on what they have to do according to the rules, rather than perhaps what families need them to do, and perhaps actually taking a more community orientation approach to social work services, which encourages us to be much more embedded in places like GP surgeries, schools, and so on, might help develop those relationships to be better able to kind of work across boundaries.
But can I just come in and say one more thing? It just struck me as I was listening to Mark and Martin. And that's, I suppose, one of the things, Neil, that would really help would be about making sure that tackling poverty is front and centre. So it's part and parcel of something that everyone is expected to do, and it's not an afterthought. And I'm just thinking, you know, and some things are sequential, like the ELC expansion was announced before we started to have the Child Poverty Act delivery plan, etc., and things like that. So some of it was about what can we do in in retrospect around it. But just listening to Mark talk about the reduction in the family centres and stuff, and how few there are left across the city. There's also an expansion in the ELC, which has had a capital programme, which has been looking at how we can create more holistic centres in parts of the country. But it was really interesting because actually that whole idea of integrating support for families as part of the ELC expansion was an outcome that was thought about after the event, you know, and by that time, plans had been drawn up, buildings had been commissioned and things in some parts of the country, and you wouldn't find those spaces in all of them, because also, I mean, you know, we are looking at a big childcare expansion. So I think one of the things I'd like to see in something like the narrative and even the actions in the new Child Poverty Delivery Plan is something around how people make it an undertaking that this is going to be one of the primary considerations of anything they're going to be doing, irrespective of the level they're at or the organisation that they're in. If it's a national mission, it has to be front and centre.
Neil, I wonder if I could just come in as well and just add in a little bit. One of the things that you put into the question was you know, how do we connect things better? I suppose, you know, one of the challenges we face is the moment we try to introduce peer researchers, we run into bureaucracy of their backgrounds. Yeah, so, you know, how do we hear the voice of experience if we exclude it because the rules that we set don't allow them to come and take part? So, you know, one of the challenges that you know we face is, how do you build trust? Because if we can't build trust with the community and the families we work with, they won't tell us what's really happening. Well, one of the ways that you build trust is if you've got shared experience or if you've got shared background. But again, we preclude it because we will say, you know, for professionals, we have to have certain background checks, we have to have certain things in place. Therefore, we exclude almost a point of appointment. Yeah. So I think there's an element for us that says, if we really want to hear and understand and do something, then again, you know, we have to believe the things that we do are the right things we do, and trust the people that we've been doing them with to come back in, if that makes sense. We need to create that space and trust. And if we start there, I think Satwat touched on silo work will start to break down, because people who understand that will just cut across the silos. Yeah. So I think there's a significant opportunity around peer research, around employing people with that experience in their background and actively pursuing that, which will help us. Because I think the challenge always comes, if you try and break down silos find a way to rebuild themselves. Yeah, if you change it more fundamentally and more culturally, and we embrace bringing in peer researchers, we embrace bringing in people with lived experience of whatever that lived experiences is, I think we start to cut across the boundaries there. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. I think that sort of segues quite neatly into a question that I was going to ask, and I guess it's a question that I think you've all kind of touched on in different ways. So it's maybe there's a risk of repetition, but I think it's worth asking a bit more directly in relation to participation, and particularly in relation to the need for services to be, shaped by communities and driven by kind of what they need. I suppose my question would be just what more can we do on participation? I think it's maybe one of these things where, we often talk a good game, but actually when it comes to the crunch, participatory practices aren't always kind of embedded in the way that we want them to be. So I suppose what more can we, by we I mean, organisations, but also local government, national government, do in relation to participation, and particularly in relation to participation and service development. So yeah, what more can we do on participation? You've all kind of touched on that in different ways, but it'd be worth, I think, John done a little bit more on that. And then a question for each of you that has sort of come in. So Satwat, there's a question around the flexible childcare model and how broadly this has been rolled out across Scotland, and maybe if you could give a little bit of thoughts on the success or otherwise of that. Mark, question for you from Laura Miller, talked about moving away from the notify, investigate model. So what's your experience of this in your social work capacity? And then finally, Martin, again, you've already touched on the peer research work, but could you tell us a little bit more about the use of peer research? You've obviously touched on some of the challenges. Maybe it'd be useful to hear a little bit more about those challenges, but also perhaps some of the kind of benefits that Includem have seen from adopting that kind of peer research model, and what that's kind of brought to your work and your services as well. That's quite a lot. So there's that key question on participation, and then you each have your own special question as well. I'll maybe start with Martin, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think I touched on participation. I think, and I'll say this badly, I'll articulate it badly, but if we don't seed the environment with people with lived experience, then I don't think participation will ever deliver what it can do. Yeah, because we've got to create the environment where we talk about no wrong door, but let's create the environment for everyone to come in there first, so that we've got the right people in the room with the right experiences to share and understand and develop. So if I did one time with the childhood bereavement coordinator for Scotland, and I spoke to one of our young people who lost a rubbish word, but her mum had died when she was a teenager. My mum died when I was a teenager. It's very hard to explain to people what that does to you, but actually someone who's sat in front of you that's actually gone through that same experience, maybe not experienced it in the same way, but has that same experience, allows a very different tone of conversation, and it creates a safe space. And for me, participation is about how do you create safe spaces for the people to come in and expose themselves, because that's what you do when you participate. You share what is in your life, in your mind, and put it out there the fear in terms of participation is that you might get hurt by doing that. So I think let's believe in participation. Let's believe in the value of lived experience by employing people and being proud about that, because it creates a safe space then for other people to participate.
Thanks, Martin. And Mark?
So yes, I suppose there's lots of things related to participation that we need to think about. So maybe just try to kind of focus on a few. I think certainly as a social work profession, we need to be better at having people actually coming into social work who have experience of things like being in care, growing up in poverty, and we're not very good at that at the minute, which I think creates issues straight away when you're talking about social work practice. I thought the promise, the outcome of the independent care review was really strong on the voices of children within the care system, and I think that's then reflected in its findings and recommendations. And also I think local authorities now have champions boards of looked after children and young people, which I think it's really important that they are listened to and have an impact. But I think we need to think more ambitiously about that. I do wonder the extent to which we actually ask parents and families involved in the child protection system how they think the system should be organised and delivered, and what kind of experience they want from it, and what is their experience of the current system, and how it needs changed, and and not just at care inspectorate reviews every few years, or when there's a complaint put in. I think we could be more ambitious about that, and that would, I have no doubt, reflect then on what social workers should be doing about addressing poverty when they're working with children and families as well. And I think all of that would be much easier if social workers were more in touch with the communities with which they're working, rather than just kind of very much kind of focusing on one family at a time. They're engaging with groups in the community as well. And part of that, that has to have an impact on how things are actually delivered. It can't just be tokenistic.
Thanks, Mark. And Satwat?
Thank you. I'll do the participation one first and then do flexible childcare, if that's okay. I think one of the things that's really important when we're looking at participation, and this is something that I don't think that any of us have got right yet, is not asking questions in a way which gives us the answers we want. Yeah, there is still that sort of bias because we're doing it from our perspective and thinking about what's going to make it possible for us to try to do something about it. So you might have the right reasons for asking in that way, but actually it's not really going to get us what we want. And that it needs to be end to end. And I think this again is one of the things I'm really interested to see how this plays out in the work of the promise and the sort of approach to service design and the engagement and the centrality of supporting those who it affects the most and who it's had the most impact on. And I think those sorts of things are critical. But I think one of the other things is, Neil, quite often people think that participation is something you can do as an add-on, but actually it needs resourced and it needs supported in order for it to be effective and meaningful for the families that we're working with. And there are some places where they've started to look at that. And I think one of the examples we always talk about is with Social Security Scotland. I mean, they're relatively new, they're growing, they're quite well resourced, but they've been thinking about this in terms of not just designing the benefits and the benefit application processes, but also in terms of their own recruitment. How can they ensure that they are able to reach, attract, encourage to apply those who have got the experience of the system and know exactly where the blocks are? Because otherwise we sit in a room not knowing what we don't know, And so, I mean, I think there are things we can build on. And then even with the benefit and application process design, it was end to end, working with a group of single parents on designing, testing, feedback, and at the end of it, coming back to say, this is what the system now looks like as a result of your input. Otherwise, you're going to get what we got in the research that we did, that I spoke about earlier, with a lot of parents saying, we're sick of being asked and not seeing, we're being asked and ignored. And we can't, for participation to be meaningful, it has to be throughout. It's not consultation. And it needs to be resourced. And I think the expertise of those with the experience needs to be formally recognised and remunerated in the same way as we all are for what we do. Because only then will you get any sort of equality around partnership or equity. And I think the other thing that's really important is even when we are going out to where people feel comfortable to do this, we're not going to get everybody. So it's really important to constantly look to see who's not there. Who are the voices that we still haven't heard? I mean, Martin's family that he spoke about in some ways was a classic example of that. But actually, single parents find it very hard to get engaged in lots of things at community level, unless you've got all the support functions in place and the childcare and all those things. If you're disabled, you might find it more difficult to get out there. And I think it comes back to the fact that we need to take that intersectional approach. it's not enough to think, actually, we've been out there have been 30 people involved in this. Are they the 30 people that are representative of the issues and the experiences that we're trying to address? So it's more complicated, I think, is what I'm saying, than simply just going out there and doing something. And we need to see it as an integral part of how we work, so it can be resourced as such. Otherwise, it's the case of I don't know if Martin, etc., and lots of other people on this call might be the same, where we get a call to say, oh, we're doing this piece of work and you get 20 single parents together within 2 days. Well, no, actually we can't. A lot of work goes into making it a meaningful experience for the individuals and not just for an information eliciting experience. So that's what I'll say on participation. In terms of flexible childcare services Scotland, I've answered in the chat. Back to Laura, but it is a separate organisation now, and it is growing and developing flexibility in childcare, and also looking at how to support providers with flexibility in childcare. And that doesn't mean every provider everywhere across the country has to be delivering maximum flexibility. It's about looking to see what's needed in each area and whether we can provide for those who need it. That's all I'll say on that.
Great, thanks, Satwat. Got quite a lot of questions to get through, so I'm going to ask two at once. They're both quite different. So the first one, both of them from Claire Simpson. One is around the UNCRC and how we can better use this, and I guess particularly the incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law to implement a rights-based approach to supporting families, and I guess particularly in relation to access to services or the development of services. So how can we use the UNCRC to a much sort of fuller extent to better enable access to services for families? And also Claire mentioned at the very beginning in the chat transport. So she talked about how a late birth or a missed pickup could impact families and the kind of knock-on impact that can have. So at the Poverty Alliance, we do and are doing lots of work on transport and poverty. So I'd be keen to hear, given that this webinar is about services kind of in the round, keen to hear your views on how the transport system works or doesn't work for the people that you work with, and what you think might be done in that regard. So yeah, one on CRC, one on your take on transport. Feel free to either answer or both or either of those. I'll maybe come to Mark first on this one.
Thanks, Neil. I was aware as well that I didn't really answer at all the notify, investigate question the last time I was on, so I'll maybe just make a response to that as well. So, my understanding was the question was what my experience was of the notify, investigate model and how I suppose how that might be changed. Certainly, as a social worker in practice, it can be very evident to see a kind of pattern of service intervention around social work where a child or children might be referred on a number of occasions related to a childcare concern. There's a kind of preliminary assessment done on in relation to which focuses largely on whether they need an allocated social worker or not, and then the case is closed, and this kind of goes through a cycle several times before the problems escalate, and then they are allocated a social worker, and it's perhaps on a more intensive basis than it needed to be. And then at the other end of service social work involvement, you can get the kind of premature closing of social work involvement before everything that's needing done at the time could have been done, which can lead to families being re-referred later down the line. And I think then it begs the question of, is this the most effective use of resources to have this kind of pattern of repeated referrals and then no further action, with a lot of resource being going into assessment rather than actually intervention and help with families. And I think one of the things that we need to be doing is, and I think we've, with austerity, we've lost services. We used to have in Edinburgh a working together team that then became the early intervention team, and then that was ended. And those workers used to have a much more of a presence in local schools to start talking about children and families where the concerns starting coming up, and working with schools in particular to think about solutions to that. We actually kind of need much more of that, where social workers have the capacity to have more of those connections, to help to work with universal services to address issues when they come up, because some of these issues are probably beyond what universal services are able to really address. But then there's a gap between then what level they need to be at for social worker to be allocated, and then it just things can escalate and get worse, and with a negative impact on children and their families. So I think I'd like to see more of more social work kind of embedded in communities to help address that. And I had another point on that, but it's gone out of my head. I'm sorry. I'll see if it comes back to me. On the I suppose on the UNCRC point, there's again services that we've lost to austerity. We used to have children's rights officers in Edinburgh, and we no longer do. We've moved to much more of a kind of advocacy service around things like children's hearings, and I think that if we don't have children's rights officers, then we need to be thinking about, similarly to what we've said about poverty being at the forefront of everybody's role, and when they're working with families, is also a rights-based approach for everybody, thinking, well, actually, are people's rights related to things like the UNCRC being respected, and if they aren't, what am I, as someone who's working with this family, going to do about it? And I think again that would require a lot of training for people, for workers to be able to undertake that kind of work as well. I'm aware that actually in Israel, with this poverty aware practice approach, they have specific social work roles which are called something like rights advocacy social workers or something along that, and along those lines, and they are there to work with families across systems to make sure that their rights are being respected and they are in receipt of what they need and are entitled to under the law. So yeah, I've spoken for too long there, probably. I'm happy to go on to someone else.
Great, thanks. That's great, Mark. And yeah, not too long at all, don't worry. Maybe come to Martin next on either or both of those questions around the UNCRC and also the transport system.
Yeah, similar to Mark, apologies, I didn't address the peer research one. I just want to do it really quickly. We employed 3, I think it was, peer researchers who we had worked with. So therefore they had lived experience of trauma, they had lived experience of stigma, and absolutely could empathize with the families that we worked with. We then supported them to engage with the families, and because they could share that lived experience, that understanding, they could give anonymity to the families, and therefore they were able to elicit from those families that we work with much more and better quality information than I think we could have. And it touches on Satwat's point, is we employed them and we paid them because that's the right thing to do, and that credibility for them also allows them to tap that onto, as it were, their understanding of the families that they were talking to. So and I think we need to do more of that. Maybe UNCRC, I think one thing I would say about it is, what worries me sometimes is we wait for something that we know is coming anyway when we could do things about it already. And therefore, I think we should start walking the talk now and not wait. Yeah. In terms of transport, anyone who knows my background knows that I used to run a rather large transport organization. I can remember going in front of transport ministers on numerous occasions with a proposal that we should have free travel for young people, especially getting them from remote locations and difficult locations. And one of the arguments that I would always take was, do you realize how difficult it is for some of these young people and families to travel to where they need to get to? Not that they're making that on purpose, that we're creating obstacles for them. And one of the obstacles we're creating is the cost of what you need to do to get to where you need to get to. So I am a huge advocate of universal free travel across all forms of transport. And I think it's something that we should be looking at. And there are other ways to do it than you know, first by bus, as it were. I think there's a universal opportunity because people do use multi forms of transport, and especially with what we've just gone through in the pandemic. So I think let's start looking properly at universal transport. The benefits of it, which we don't calculate and we don't see, are just colossal. I didn't touch on it, but part of the case study that we had is if a young person moves school and therefore can't afford to get the bus to go to the new school that they've gone to, that should just not be an issue. Yeah, and I think universal transport takes away the stigma, takes away the challenge there. Let's just do it. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Martin. And finally, Satwat.
Thank you. I'm just going to echo that point Martin's made about transport. I also think if we're looking at joining things up and coherence, it's critical to how we address the issues as a result of climate change and the climate chaos we're seeing. So actually public transport, high quality public transport that's accessible, frequent, and actually is integrated into other services when planning. So you know where the childcare is, you know where the schools are, the routes are being planned in such a way to make it easier for people to get around to where they need to be, would be a huge benefit and meet a whole series of outcomes. And I think that's the sort of like, you know, we keep being asked about game changers and big ticket items and stuff like that. That's going to be tackling poverty and what we can do within the powers we have in Scotland. There's a lot we can do around these things that would make a significant difference to household costs. And also it would support with helping make work pay. I mean, I didn't go into it either, but in some parts of Scotland, the costs of transport are so prohibitive in terms of how you can reach work and actually make work pay for you in any way. And in terms of Claire's question around UNCRC, Claire, I think I'm going to be slightly cynical about this because I am a wee bit cynical. We like signing up to things. We like showing how as a nation, we're really good and committed to certain things, but then we need to resource them because those rights need to be made real and access to those rights need to be made real for children and young people. And what Mark was saying about what we've lost in terms of those who could support with advocacy and cases to test rights to make sure that people are getting what they're entitled to has to be part and parcel of that. So does recourse. If things aren't going right, we need to have things built in. And I think one of the things that I found, I suppose, with some of the changes that came around with the Children and Young Persons Act from 2014, it's really important to be specific and precise when legislation is being drafted and guidance is being drafted. We can't leave loopholes. We've got far too many loopholes and things at the moment that are open to interpretation, which make it really difficult when you're trying to get your rights realized. But in terms of why, for me, it's right up there. I mean, we need to be looking at child poverty as a human rights issue, you know, in terms of how it affects the child, but in how it affects the family, and how it affects us as a society and as community. And there's a whole series of articles in there which directly relate to this, let alone the whole thing. But to me, it fundamentally goes down to, is this just something we're saying it's great, we can say we've signed up to, or are we actually going to put the resource into it? And I think we need to be pushing for that resource to go into it so that we can support children, young people and families to make those rights real rights.
Thank you, Satwat. Thank you to all three for those answers. We've got about 2.5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one final question and you can answer it in as brief a statement as you like. So like one line. So let's, we've got the Child Poverty Delivery Plan, the new Child Poverty Delivery Plan. It's been published next year. If you speak to the CABSEC and you're asked for one thing to include within that would make a real significant difference in terms of services, And this is not a realistic question because you can't just have one thing, but I'm just, let's play a bit here. One absolute key thing that we need in that child poverty delivery plan, what would it be in relation to services and in relation to tackling child poverty? I'll maybe come to Martin first, and it can be as brief as you like.
I touch on what Satwat just said. For me, in terms of one thing that would, I think, make a huge difference is that universal travel connected to universal services, connected to participation. And I think if we could do that, then we would be a big step forward.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And Mark?
I would say that there was quite a well-known report in relation to children's hearing system or the child protection system that came out that said it's everyone's job to make sure I'm all right. Putting forward this view that actually child protection is everyone's responsibility, and I think similarly it needs to be the case that addressing poverty is everyone's responsibility, so that services and staff working with people are able to make a change to help children and their families with these issues.
Thanks, Mark. And finally, Satwat.
I'm going to say we need to look at universal basic services as was set out in the Social Renewal Advisory Board report, and that would include childcare, housing, some of the big ticket items that we don't think about as universal basic services, and have alongside that the minimum income guarantee. And so actually I know it's not service based, but I do think it's so important to get money into people's pockets, and I would say that you need to look at what's going to make the difference to the families, the children live in poverty, and how do we get that money to them. So I know we've got the £20, and I know there's the campaign to sort of increase it and stuff like that, but that's still going to leave some of those families in that deep and persistent poverty. And that's where, for me, it has to be an integration of increasing income into families, but also providing more services for free.
Great. Thanks very much. Solutions focused way to end, I think, is really important. We're out of time now, so just thank you again very much to all of our speakers. I think we had three brilliant contributions, and I really appreciate Satwat, Martin and Mark, you taking the time out to participate today. And thanks also to everyone for attending and for all of your questions and your comments. I should say that a few weeks ago we published our Get Heard Scotland 2020-2021 annual report. So that contains some of the key points and issues and solutions, importantly, raised in our Get Heard Scotland discussions with people from April 2020 to April 2021, which is obviously quite a busy period. And you can check that out on our website. So again, thank you very much for coming along today. So this discussion will be fed directly into the Scottish Government as part of the development of the new Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. And I'd also really, really strongly encourage you to engage with the Scottish Government as part of that process. I think Mark said something in his presentation around the perception sometimes that poverty can be too big to tackle and too familiar to notice, I think was the phrase. And I think that is the challenge that we can often face. But I think it's critical to challenging that perception will be highlighting the actual real world solutions that we know work. And we've heard a lot today about walking the walk and just doing it. And I think for me, particularly in relation to services that we need to better tackle poverty, I think that's the key takeaway message from me, from all speakers today. I think, to offer a personal opinion, that the next few years needs to be a phase of moving from rhetoric to reality, and I think the Child Poverty Delivery Plan will be really, really critical and key in driving that. So yeah, we'll end on that. So yeah, thank you again very much to all of our speakers and to everyone coming along, and have a good weekend when it comes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.